Welcome, wanderer of the wasteland, to a tale carved in blood and bronze beneath the burning sun of the American Southwest. Tonight, we follow the rise and reign of Caesar's legion, from the chance encounter that birthed an empire to the endless campaigns that forged a nation from tribal chaos. Here, in the quiet hours, let your mind drift across the Colorado River and into the lands where the bull reigns supreme. Close your eyes and let the rhythm of marching legionaries carry you into peaceful slumber as we chronicle every triumph, every conquest, and every brutal decision that transformed scattered tribes into the most feared military force the post-war world has ever known. The morning of 2246 dawned clear and bright over the ruins of Los Angeles, casting long shadows through the skeletal remains of pre-war skyscrapers that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. In the settlement that had grown around the old boneyard, the followers of the apocalypse were already beginning their daily routines of education, medical care, and the preservation of knowledge that had survived humanity's greatest folly. Among them moved a young man whose destiny would reshape the entire American Southwest, though he could not have imagined such a future as he prepared for what seemed like a routine academic expedition. Edward Salo was 20 years old that spring, tall and lean with the kind of intense intellectual curiosity that marked him as one of the followers' most promising scholars. His specialty lay in anthropology and linguistics, fields that had taken on new importance in a world where tribal cultures had emerged from the ashes of nuclear devastation, each developing its own unique dialects, customs, and social structures. The followers viewed this diversity as a treasure trove of human adaptation, worthy of study and preservation before it could be lost to the inevitable march of time and circumstance. The expedition that would change everything had been planned for months, organized with the methodical precision that characterized all followers' endeavors. Their destination was the Grand Canyon, that natural wonder which had survived the Great War intact, its ancient majesty unmarred by human folly. Reports had reached the boneyard of numerous tribal groups inhabiting the canyon and its surrounding territories, each speaking distinct dialects that might hold clues to the evolution of post-war language and culture. Salo's companions for this journey included Bill Calhoun, a physician whose medical expertise would be invaluable during extended travel through dangerous wasteland territories. Calhoun was older than Salo, a steady and cautious man who approached the unknown with scientific skepticism tempered by humanitarian compassion. The dynamic between them reflected the dual nature of the followers themselves. Salo's burning curiosity about human societies balanced by Calhoun's practical concern for human welfare. The third member of their party was perhaps the most crucial, though none of them could have predicted how pivotal his role would become. Joshua Graham was a Mormon missionary who had spent years among the tribes of the Southwest, learning their languages and customs while spreading his faith through word and example. Graham possessed the kind of linguistic knowledge that took decades to acquire, his mind a repository of tribal dialects, cultural nuances, and the subtle art of translation between vastly different worldviews. The route to the Grand Canyon took them through landscapes that still bore the scars of nuclear devastation, twisted terrain where radiation had transformed the very essence of life itself. Yet even in these blighted wastelands, nature had begun its slow work of recovery, with hardy plants and mutated creatures establishing new ecosystems among the ruins of the old world. For Salo, every mile of their journey provided evidence of humanity's remarkable capacity for adaptation and survival. The discovery that would alter the course of history occurred during a rest stop in what had once been a small pre-war town, now reduced to scattered foundations and the occasional intact structure that had somehow weathered 2 centuries of neglect and environmental assault. seeking shelter from a sandstorm that had turned the afternoon air into a stinging, choking haze. The expedition took refuge in what appeared to be the remnants of a library or archive. The books they found there had been preserved by some miracle of circumstance, protected from moisture and radiation by the peculiar way the building had collapsed, creating a sealed pocket that had maintained stable conditions for over 200 years. Most of the collection had been reduced to illegible fragments, but among the salvageable volumes were two texts that would reshape Sallow's understanding of human civilization and his own role in its future development. The first was Edward Gibbon's monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Its multiple volumes somehow intact, despite the passage of centuries. As Sallow carefully turned the brittle pages, reading by the light of their small fire while the sandstorm raged outside, he encountered a civilization that dwarfed anything he had previously studied. Here was an empire that had spanned continents, endured for over a millennium, and left an indelible mark on human culture that persisted long after its political collapse. The second text proved even more transformative. Julius Caesar's Commentaries on the Gallic Wars provided a first-person account of imperial expansion, written by the man who had conquered Gaul and transformed the Roman Republic into an empire. Through Caesar's own words, Sallow gained insight into the mind of a conqueror, the strategic thinking that could unite diverse tribes under a single banner, and the political genius required to transform military victory into lasting cultural change. Night after night, as they made camp during their journey toward the Grand Canyon, Sallow immersed himself in these ancient texts, his mind racing with possibilities and connections that seemed to bridge the gap between past and future. The parallels between Caesar's Gaul and the modern American wasteland were striking. Both were landscapes populated by warring tribes. Both offered opportunities for a sufficiently bold and intelligent leader to impose order through conquest and cultural transformation. Graham watched Sallow's growing obsession with these Roman texts with something approaching concern, though he could not have predicted where such intellectual enthusiasm would ultimately lead. The missionary had seen many scholars become captivated by their studies, but there was something different about the intensity with which Sallow absorbed Caesar's strategic insights and Gibbon's historical analysis. It was as if the young anthropologist was not merely reading about ancient history, but discovering a blueprint for his own future actions. When they finally reached the Grand Canyon, the sight that greeted them was both breathtaking and sobering. The natural wonder remained as magnificent as ever, its layered rock formations telling the story of geological ages that dwarfed human concerns. But the human presence in and around the canyon told a different story entirely, one of conflict, desperation, and the constant struggle for survival that characterized life in the post-war world. Their first contact with the local tribes came through the Blackfoot, a post-war group that bore no relation to the historical Native American tribe of the same name, but had adopted the nomenclature as part of their cultural identity. The Blackfoot inhabited one of the more defensible positions within the canyon system, their settlements built into natural rock formations that provided protection from both enemies and the harsh desert environment. Initial communications proceeded smoothly, with Graham serving as interpreter between the expedition members and the tribal leaders. His years of experience had taught him the delicate art of cross-cultural communication, the patience required to build trust with people who had learned to view strangers as potential threats. The Blackfoot seemed genuinely curious about these visitors from the distant boneyard, particularly their strange mix of advanced medical knowledge and scholarly interests. But the fragile peace of first contact was shattered by a single moment of miscommunication, a translation error that transformed curiosity into suspicion and hospitality into hostility. The exact nature of Graham's mistake was never clearly determined, perhaps a misunderstood gesture, a wrongly interpreted phrase, or simply the inevitable collision between vastly different worldviews. What mattered was the result. The Blackfoot leadership concluded that these strangers posed a threat that could not be tolerated. The capture came swiftly and without warning, demonstrating the tactical sophistication that even supposedly primitive tribal groups had developed in their constant struggle for survival. One moment the expedition was engaged in what seemed like productive, scholarly exchange. The next they found themselves bound and guarded, their equipment confiscated, their freedom forfeit to the changing moods of tribal politics. The Blackfoot's intentions became clear through subsequent interrogations and the fragments of conversation that Graham could translate. They planned to hold the expedition for ransom, though the identity of the intended payer remained mysterious. Perhaps they hoped to extract payment from the followers of the apocalypse, or maybe they had mistaken their captives for representatives of some other faction with deeper pockets and greater resources. During the long days of captivity that followed, Sallow began to understand the desperate circumstances that had driven the Blackfoot to such extreme measures. Through careful observation and the information Graham could glean from their captors, a picture emerged of a tribe under siege, locked in simultaneous conflicts with no fewer than 7 other groups, each equally determined to claim the canyon's limited resources for themselves. The mathematics of the situation was stark and unforgiving. The Blackfoot were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. Their enemies pressed them from every direction, gradually constricting the territory they could safely control, slowly strangling their access to water sources, hunting grounds, and trade routes. Even if they managed to extract ransom for their captives, such a temporary windfall would do little to address the fundamental strategic problems that threatened their very survival. It was during these observations that Sallow began to formulate the plan that would transform him from captive scholar to military strategist, from Edward Sallow into the man who would become Caesar. The Roman texts he had studied so intensively provided the theoretical framework, while the Blackfoot's desperate situation offered the practical opportunity to test ancient strategies against modern problems. The parallels were undeniable. Caesar had faced similar circumstances in Gaul, confronting numerous tribal groups locked in perpetual warfare, each too proud to submit voluntarily, but too weak individually to resist a sufficiently organized and ruthless conqueror. The key was not to join the existing conflict, but to transform its very nature, to replace the chaos of tribal warfare with the disciplined efficiency of imperial conquest. Against Calhoun's vehement objections, Sallow approached the Blackfoot leadership with a proposal that seemed to offer mutual benefit. He would share his knowledge of warfare and strategy, teaching them tactical innovations that could turn the tide of their multiple conflicts. In exchange, they would guarantee safe passage for the expedition once their military situation had been stabilized. The tribal leaders were initially skeptical of advice from a captive, particularly one whose people had never demonstrated military prowess comparable to the great warrior societies of the wasteland. But Sallow's offer came with practical demonstrations that spoke louder than words. He taught them improved methods for maintaining and operating their existing firearms, techniques for manufacturing explosives from readily available materials, and small unit tactics that maximized the effectiveness of limited manpower. Most importantly, Sallow introduced concepts of strategic thinking that went beyond the immediate tactical concerns that had dominated tribal warfare for generations. Instead of viewing conflict as a series of isolated raids and skirmishes, he helped the Blackfoot leadership understand war as a systematic process designed to achieve specific political objectives through the organized application of violence. The transformation in Blackfoot military effectiveness was dramatic and immediate. Their first target was the ridges, identified as the weakest of their enemies and therefore the logical starting point for a campaign of systematic conquest. Under Sallow's guidance, the tribe abandoned their traditional approach to warfare, which had emphasized individual heroism and limited objectives, in favor of total war designed to achieve complete victory, regardless of cost. The siege of the ridges demonstrated the horrific effectiveness of Sallow's strategic innovations. Traditional tribal warfare had operated according to unwritten rules that limited casualties and preserved the possibility of future accommodation between enemies. Sallow introduced concepts that shattered these limitations, teaching the Blackfoot to view warfare not as ritualized conflict, but as a tool for complete political transformation. When the ridges refused to surrender despite being surrounded and outgunned, Sallow made the decision that would define his approach to conquest for the remainder of his career. He ordered the complete extermination of the tribe, men, women, and children killed without mercy or discrimination. The massacre served multiple purposes. It eliminated potential future resistance, provided a terrifying example for other enemies, and demonstrated to the Blackfoot that their new war chief was prepared to embrace methods that previous leaders had considered unthinkable. The psychological impact of the ridge's destruction rippled throughout the canyon, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape in ways that traditional tribal leaders struggled to comprehend. The next target, the Kaibabs, found themselves facing not just military defeat, but the prospect of complete annihilation, a fate that had previously been unimaginable in the context of tribal warfare. Confronted with this new reality, the Kaibabs chose survival over honor, surrendering unconditionally rather than facing the genocidal fate that had befallen the ridges. Their capitulation established the pattern that would characterize Sallow's approach to conquest throughout his career. Overwhelming force, combined with the credible threat of total destruction, offering potential enemies a stark choice between submission and extinction. The integration of Kaibab survivors into Blackfoot society provided Sallow with his first practical experience in the techniques of cultural assimilation that would later become hallmarks of his imperial system. Rather than simply incorporating defeated enemies as subordinate allies, he began the systematic process of destroying existing tribal identities and replacing them with new loyalties centered on his own leadership and strategic vision. As victory followed victory, the Blackfoot began to view Sallow not merely as a gifted advisor, but as something approaching a supernatural figure, a war leader whose strategic insights seemed to transcend normal human limitations. This growing cult of personality provided him with the political foundation necessary to implement increasingly radical changes in tribal organization and military structure. The conquest of the Fredonians and the remaining canyon tribes proceeded with mechanical efficiency, each victory reinforcing the new paradigm of total warfare, while providing additional manpower and resources for future campaigns. Sallow's strategic genius lay not just in military tactics but in his understanding of how conquest could become self-perpetuating, with each success providing the foundation for even greater achievements. During the long nights between campaigns, Sallow continued his intensive study of Roman history and political theory, searching for solutions to the practical problems of governing diverse populations, united only by fear and military defeat. The answer he found would transform him from a successful warlord into the founder of an empire that would eventually span multiple states. The decision to adopt Roman identity as the unifying principle for his growing confederation was born from practical necessity rather than romantic nostalgia. The various tribal groups under his control retained distinct languages, customs, and historical grievances that threatened to tear his coalition apart once immediate military pressure was removed. Traditional tribal identities were too deeply rooted to be eliminated without generating perpetual resistance, but they were also too fragmentary to serve as the foundation for lasting political unity. Roman civilization offered something unprecedented: a cultural template so completely removed from existing tribal contexts that it could serve as neutral ground for unified identity formation. By requiring all his followers to abandon their traditional names, languages, and customs in favor of Roman alternatives, Salo created a new form of cultural identity that transcended existing tribal boundaries, while establishing his own authority as the sole legitimate interpreter of their shared heritage. The transformation of Edward Salo into Caesar was both symbolic and practical, marking his evolution from captive scholar to imperial founder. The name itself carried historical weight that reinforced his claim to absolute authority, while connecting his personal leadership to the broader civilizational project he envisioned for the post-war world. The establishment of Latin as the official language of his growing empire required massive educational efforts that had the additional benefit of breaking down communication barriers between formerly hostile groups. Veterans of different tribal backgrounds could serve together effectively only when they shared common vocabulary and conceptual frameworks for military organization and strategic thinking. More importantly, the adoption of Roman religious practices, particularly the worship of Mars as the god of war, provided ideological justification for the continuous expansion that had become essential to the empire's survival. Military conquest was no longer merely a practical necessity but a sacred duty, transforming every campaign into a holy war that served both political and spiritual objectives. The rejection of Calhoun and the dismissal of Graham marked Caesar's final break with his past identity and the humanitarian principles that had originally motivated his scholarly pursuits. The physicians' horrified objections to the genocidal methods being employed fell on deaf ears, his medical ethics irrelevant to the harsh realities of imperial expansion. Graham's elevation to the position of Malpais legate represented not reward for past service, but recognition that effective conquest required subordinates capable of implementing strategies without moral qualms. As the sun set over the Grand Canyon on that first year of conquest, the man who had entered the region as a captive scholar emerged as Caesar, founder of a military empire that would eventually challenge the largest post-war nation on the continent. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and pregnant with consequences that would reshape the American Southwest for generations to come. The tribes that had once fought endless wars over limited resources now marched under a single banner, their individual identities subsumed into something larger and more terrible than any of them could have imagined. Caesar's legion was born in blood and forged in fire, its foundations laid not on noble principles but on the brutal pragmatism of total war and cultural annihilation. The first years following Caesar's transformation from captive scholar to imperial founder were marked by a systematic campaign of conquest that extended far beyond the Grand Canyon's natural boundaries, reaching into the broader territories of Arizona, where dozens of tribal groups maintained precarious existences amid the harsh realities of post-war survival. The success against the Seven Canyon tribes had provided Caesar with more than military victory. It had given him the foundational elements of an imperial system that could absorb, transform, and utilize conquered populations in ways that previous wasteland leaders had never imagined. The expansion beyond the canyon required strategic thinking that went far beyond simple military conquest, encompassing questions of logistics, administration, and cultural integration that would determine whether Caesar's early victories could be transformed into lasting imperial control. The Roman texts that had inspired his initial transformation continued to serve as guides, but their ancient wisdom required adaptation to the unique circumstances of a post-nuclear world where radiation, mutation, and the collapse of industrial civilization created challenges that even the greatest empire of antiquity had never faced. The Painted Rock tribe represented Caesar's first major conquest outside the Grand Canyon region, their settlements located in the distinctive red stone formations that gave them their name. Unlike the desperate, weakened groups he had first encountered, the Painted Rock warriors possessed significant military experience and had established themselves as one of the region's dominant powers through decades of successful raiding and territorial expansion. Their defeat would require not just tactical brilliance, but strategic innovations that demonstrated Caesar's growing sophistication as a military commander. The campaign against the Painted Rock tribe lasted nearly 6 months, its extended duration reflecting both the enemy's formidable defensive capabilities and Caesar's deliberate decision to use the conflict as a training ground for his evolving legion structure. Rather than simply overwhelming his opponents through superior numbers or firepower, Caesar chose to treat the war as a practical laboratory, where he could test and refine the organizational principles that would eventually govern an empire spanning multiple states. The military innovations developed during the Painted Rock campaign would become standard legion doctrine for decades to come, establishing patterns of organization, discipline, and tactical deployment that proved effective against every enemy Caesar would subsequently encounter. The creation of the centurion rank represented perhaps the most significant of these developments, providing a command structure that could maintain cohesion and effectiveness even during the chaos of extended combat operations. Centurions were selected not merely for their individual combat prowess, but for their demonstrated ability to maintain unit discipline under the extreme stress of warfare, their tactical intelligence in adapting to changing battlefield conditions, and most importantly, their absolute loyalty to Caesar's vision of imperial expansion. The selection process itself became a mechanism for identifying and promoting the most capable leaders, while eliminating potential rivals who might challenge Caesar's supreme authority. The defeat of the Painted Rock tribe provided Caesar with his first substantial population of experienced warriors whose skills could be integrated into his growing military machine without the extensive training required for recruits drawn from less martial backgrounds. The assimilation process, however, required innovations in cultural transformation that went beyond the relatively simple methods that had proven effective with the smaller, less sophisticated canyon tribes. The destruction of tribal identity among the Painted Rock warriors necessitated not just the elimination of their traditional names, languages, and customs, but the systematic replacement of their entire worldview with Roman-inspired alternatives that served Caesar's imperial objectives. This process, which would later be refined and applied to dozens of other conquered groups, involved a combination of indoctrination, intimidation, and incentive that proved remarkably effective in transforming former enemies into loyal legionaries. The adoption of Latin names represented more than symbolic change. It created new identities that severed psychological connections to pre-conquest loyalties, while establishing clear hierarchies based on merit and service to the Port 46 legion rather than traditional tribal status. A former Painted Rock war chief might find himself serving as a common legionary under the command of a centurion whose origins lay in a completely different tribal background, the Roman naming system making such arrangements seem natural rather than humiliating. The religious transformation proved even more crucial to long-term stability than the military reorganization, with the worship of Mars providing ideological justification for the continuous warfare that had become essential to legion expansion. Traditional tribal religions, with their emphasis on ancestral spirits and territorial sanctity, were fundamentally incompatible with imperial expansion, creating psychological barriers to the kind of aggressive warfare that Caesar's strategic vision required. Mars worship, by contrast, transformed military service from a necessary burden into a sacred calling, making every legionary a priest warrior whose combat effectiveness directly served divine will. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Men who might have been reluctant to fight beyond their traditional territories became eager participants in campaigns of unlimited expansion, viewing conquest not as aggression but as religious duty. The establishment of legion settlements in former Painted Rock territory provided Caesar with his first opportunity to implement the administrative systems that would eventually govern civilian populations throughout his empire. These early experiments in imperial governance revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of direct military rule, leading to innovations that balanced the need for absolute control with the practical requirements of economic productivity and social stability. The civilian population in newly conquered territories found themselves subject to a form of governance that was simultaneously more intrusive and more protective than traditional tribal leadership had provided. Caesar's system eliminated the chaotic violence that had characterized intertribal relations, while imposing a level of social control that regulated everything from economic activity to personal relationships according to principles designed to serve imperial rather than individual interests. The economic integration of conquered territories required innovations that went beyond simple tribute collection, encompassing the development of trade networks, resource allocation systems, and currency standards that could unite diverse regional economies under centralized imperial control. The adoption of precious metal currency represented a crucial step in this direction, providing a medium of exchange that maintained value across territorial boundaries while reducing dependence on barter systems that favored local over imperial interests. The Sundog tribe, encountered during Caesar's second year of expansion, presented different challenges than the militarily sophisticated Painted Rock warriors. Their small size and nomadic lifestyle made them difficult to locate and engage in conventional warfare, but their intimate knowledge of desert survival techniques and their established trade relationships with more sedentary groups made their conquest strategically valuable. Despite the relatively modest increase in military manpower, their bay absorption would provide. The campaign against the Sundogs became a study in the application of total warfare principles to enemies who could not be defeated through conventional military engagement. Caesar's solution involved the systematic elimination of the water sources, trade partners, and safe havens that made nomadic survival possible, gradually constricting the tribe's operational territory until surrender became the only alternative to extinction through dehydration and starvation. The psychological impact of this campaign extended far beyond its immediate military objectives, demonstrating to other potential enemies that Caesar's strategic reach extended beyond traditional battlefield engagements to encompass every aspect of life in the post-war wasteland. No group was too small to merit attention. No survival strategy too clever to be countered. No alliance too distant to be severed through the systematic application of imperial power. The eventual surrender of the Sundogs provided Caesar with tribal specialists whose knowledge of desert survival, water location, and long-distance navigation proved invaluable during subsequent campaigns in the harsh Arizona territories. More importantly, their integration into the Legion demonstrated the Empire's capacity to utilize, rather than simply destroy, the specialized knowledge that different tribal groups had developed over generations of adaptation to post-war conditions. The Twin Mothers tribe occupied a unique position in the regional political landscape. Their settlements, built around natural hot springs that provided not only reliable water sources, but also the raw materials for herbal medicines, that had made them valuable trading partners for groups throughout the Arizona territories. Their conquest represented Caesar's first encounter with enemies whose value lay not in military potential, but in their control of resources that could benefit the entire imperial system. The siege of the Twin Mothers settlements lasted only 3 weeks, their defensive positions proving inadequate against the disciplined assault tactics that Caesar's forces had perfected during previous campaigns. However, the real challenge came not during the military phase, but in the subsequent integration of their specialized knowledge into legion medical practices, a process that required unprecedented cooperation between Roman military discipline and traditional tribal healing techniques. The development of healing powder, bitter drink, and other medicinal innovations that emerged from this cultural synthesis would eventually become standard legion medical practice, providing military advantages that proved crucial during the extended campaigns required for imperial expansion. The ability to treat battlefield injuries effectively and keep wounded legionaries in fighting condition represented a force multiplier that gave Caesar's armies significant advantages over enemies who lacked comparable medical support. The religious significance of healing practices among the Twin Mothers required particularly careful handling during the assimilation process. Their traditional beliefs about the spiritual dimensions of medicine, proving more compatible with Mars worship than Caesar had initially anticipated. The transformation of healing from a peaceful art into a tool of war provided additional ideological reinforcement for the legion's military culture, while preserving valuable knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the post-conquest process. The systematic destruction of traditional tribal names, languages, and customs accelerated during Caesar's 3rd year of expansion, the process becoming more efficient and comprehensive as legion administrators gained experience in cultural transformation techniques. The goal was not merely the elimination of potential sources of resistance, but the creation of a genuinely unified imperial culture that could serve as the foundation for unlimited territorial expansion. The Latin language requirement represented perhaps the most ambitious aspect of this cultural transformation, demanding that hundreds of former tribal members master not only basic communication skills, but also the military terminology, religious concepts, and administrative vocabulary necessary for effective participation in imperial society. The educational programs developed to support this linguistic transition became models for similar efforts throughout Caesar's growing empire. The selection and training of legion officers during this period established patterns of meritocratic advancement that would characterize imperial administration throughout Caesar's reign and beyond. Unlike traditional tribal leadership, which typically involved hereditary positions or selection based on narrow criteria specific to particular cultural contexts, legion promotion depended on demonstrated competence in warfare, administration, and loyalty to imperial objectives. The development of the decanus rank provided a crucial intermediate leadership level between ordinary legionaries and centurions, creating career advancement opportunities that motivated exceptional performance while ensuring that capable leaders could be identified and promoted before they became dissatisfied with their positions. This systematic approach to talent development gave the legion significant advantages over enemies whose leadership structures remained based on traditional tribal patterns. The establishment of Flagstaff as Caesar's capital represented a crucial evolution from the purely military organization of his early campaigns toward the development of permanent administrative institutions capable of governing civilian population across vaste territorial expanse. The choice of location reflected strategic considerations that balanced defensive capabilities with access to trade routes and natural resources necessary for supporting a growing imperial bureaucracy. The construction of permanent fortifications, administrative buildings, and residential facilities in Flagstaff required organizational capabilities that went far beyond traditional tribal construction projects, necessitating the development of engineering expertise, resource allocation systems, and labor management techniques that would later prove essential during major infrastructure projects throughout the empire. The capital became both a symbol of imperial permanence and a practical demonstration of the legion's capacity to create as well as destroy. The integration of Joshua Graham into the imperial hierarchy as Malpais legate represented Caesar's recognition that effective expansion would require subordinate commanders capable of independent strategic thinking while remaining absolutely loyal to imperial objectives. Graham's linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and personal loyalty made him an ideal candidate for the position, but his elevation also established precedents for the delegation of authority that would become necessary as the empire grew beyond Caesar's capacity for direct personal control. The relationship between Caesar and his first legate illustrated the complex dynamics of imperial leadership, combining personal friendship with institutional authority in ways that served both emotional and strategic needs. Graham's role as military commander allowed Caesar to focus on broader political and administrative questions, while ensuring that expansion campaigns continued to reflect his strategic vision and tactical innovations. The economic systems that emerged during this period of rapid expansion required innovations that balanced the immediate resource needs of continuous military campaigning with the long-term development requirements of stable imperial governance. The tribute system, established in conquered territories, provided the legion with the material resources necessary for further expansion while creating economic incentives for peaceful cooperation with imperial administration. The development of trade networks connecting previously isolated tribal territories created new opportunities for economic specialization and resource sharing that benefited both the imperial system and local populations. Former enemies found themselves participating in commercial relationships that would have been impossible under traditional tribal arrangements. The security provided by legion administration, making long-distance trade safe and profitable for the first time in generations. The recruitment and training of new legionaries accelerated during the 4th and 5th years of expansion, the growing empire requiring military forces that could simultaneously maintain control over conquered territories and spearhead further conquest campaigns. The integration of tribal warriors into legion ranks required training programs that balanced the preservation of valuable combat skills with the elimination of cultural loyalties that might undermine imperial unity. The standardization of equipment, tactics, and organizational procedures across all legion forces reflected Caesar's understanding that effective imperial expansion required military units capable of coordinating complex operations, regardless of their diverse tribal origins. The development of common training standards, communication protocols, and command structures created a unified military machine that proved more effective than any force the post-war wasteland had previously seen. The religious dimensions of legion culture continued to evolve during this period, Mars worship becoming more sophisticated and systematic as it incorporated elements from various tribal traditions while maintaining its essential focus on warfare as a sacred calling. The development of formal religious hierarchies, ceremonial practices, and theological doctrines provided additional mechanisms for social control while satisfying the spiritual needs of diverse populations united under imperial rule. The establishment of Mars festivals, victory celebrations, and military religious ceremonies created shared cultural experiences that transcended tribal origins while reinforcing the values and objectives that Caesar considered essential for imperial unity. These events served both practical and symbolic purposes, providing opportunities for military training and political indoctrination, while creating emotional bonds between legionaries who might otherwise have maintained loyalty to their pre-conquest tribal identities. The systematic elimination of tribal historians, cultural specialists, and traditional leaders during this period reflected Caesar's understanding that lasting imperial control required not just military defeat, but the complete destruction of alternative sources of authority and identity. The preservation of useful knowledge, while eliminating potentially subversive cultural elements, required careful discrimination between different aspects of tribal heritage. The creation of legion historical narratives, cultural traditions, and educational curricula provided positive alternatives to the tribal identities being systematically eliminated, giving former tribal members new sources of pride and belonging that served imperial rather than particularistic interests. The development of legion mythology, heroic stories, and cultural symbols created emotional attachments to imperial identity that proved more durable than loyalties based solely on fear or material incentive. As Caesar's fifth year of expansion drew to a close, the transformation from tribal confederation to imperial system had become irreversible. The cultural and institutional innovations of the early period having created a self-perpetuating mechanism for continued growth and consolidation. The legion had evolved from a collection of conquered tribes into something unprecedented in the post-war world. A genuine empire capable of unlimited expansion and permanent territorial control. The foundations laid during these formative years would prove crucial during the greater challenges that awaited Caesar's empire as it expanded beyond the relatively isolated tribal territories of Arizona into contact with larger, more sophisticated political entities. The organizational structures, cultural practices, and administrative systems developed through trial and error during the conquest of dozens of small tribes would soon be tested against enemies possessing industrial capabilities, advanced weapons, and political sophistication that matched or exceeded Caesar's own imperial innovations. But for now, in the quiet years before the great confrontations that would define his historical legacy, Caesar could survey his domain with satisfaction, knowing that he had succeeded in transforming the chaos of tribal warfare into the ordered brutality of imperial conquest. The foundations of empire were complete, ready to support whatever grand designs his ambitions might demand. The eastern campaigns that followed Caesar's consolidation of Arizona would prove to be the most challenging and transformative period of legion expansion, testing not only the military innovations developed during the tribal conquests, but also the fundamental assumptions underlying Caesar's imperial vision. The territories beyond Arizona's borders presented obstacles that the relatively isolated canyon and desert tribes had never posed. Vast distances that strained supply lines, hostile environments that challenged even the legion's legendary endurance, and most significantly, tribal confederations whose military sophistication and political organization approached Caesar's own in complexity and effectiveness. The decision to expand eastward rather than westward during this critical phase of imperial development reflected strategic calculations that would shape the legion's character for decades to come. The Western territories, while potentially rich in resources and population, were already beginning to show signs of organization under what would eventually become the new California Republic. Caesar's intelligence networks, still primitive compared to the sophisticated spy apparatus he would later develop, nevertheless provided enough information to suggest that westward expansion would eventually bring his forces into conflict with enemies possessing industrial capabilities and unified command structures that could match or exceed his own military advantages. The Eastern Territories, by contrast, offered opportunities for continued expansion against tribal enemies whose organizational patterns remained familiar despite their greater size and sophistication. The vast expanses of New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah contained dozens of tribal groups whose conflicts with each other prevented the kind of unified resistance that might have stopped Caesar's expansion during its crucial early phases. More importantly, these territories offered strategic depth that would allow the legion to develop the administrative and logistical capabilities necessary for eventual confrontation with more advanced enemies. The campaign against the Hydebarks marked the beginning of this eastern expansion and would prove to be one of the most significant military operations in Legion history, not merely because of its strategic importance, but because it produced the warrior who would eventually become Lanius, the monster of the East. The Hydebarks occupied territories in what had once been southern Colorado, their settlements built around natural defensive positions that had allowed them to maintain independence despite pressure from numerous neighboring tribes. The Hydebarks possessed military capabilities that exceeded anything Caesar's forces had previously encountered. Their warriors trained from childhood in combat techniques that emphasized individual prowess while maintaining unit cohesion during large-scale engagements. Their weapons were better maintained than those of most wasteland groups, their armor more sophisticated, and most importantly, their tactical knowledge reflected generations of experience in warfare against enemies who possessed comparable military capabilities. The siege of the Hydebark territories lasted nearly 8 months, its extended duration reflecting not Legion weakness, but Caesar's deliberate decision to use the campaign as a proving ground for military innovations that would be required during future operations against even more formidable enemies. The development of siege techniques, supply line management, and coordinated assaults involving multiple Legion centuries required practical experience that could only be gained through extended operations against determined resistance. The warrior who would become Lanius emerged during the final phases of the Hydebark campaign, his extraordinary combat abilities becoming apparent during the desperate fighting that characterized the tribe's last stand. Standing over 7 feet tall and possessed of physical strength that seemed to transcend normal human limitations, he single-handedly destroyed entire Legion patrols before the main assault had even begun. His reputation for invincibility, spreading throughout both armies long before Caesar had any direct knowledge of his existence. The psychological impact of this individual warrior on both the Hydebarks and the Legion forces created tactical problems that Caesar had never previously encountered. The Hydebarks, already facing overwhelming numerical disadvantages, found their morale elevated beyond rational calculation by the presence of a champion whose combat effectiveness seemed to validate their resistance against impossible odds. The Legion's centuries, meanwhile, began to show signs of reluctance that threatened to undermine the aggressive tactics that had made their previous victories possible. Caesar's solution to this unprecedented challenge demonstrated the evolution of his strategic thinking from the relatively straightforward approaches that had proven effective against smaller, less sophisticated enemies. Rather than attempting to eliminate the Hydebark champion through conventional military action, he chose to exploit the tribal cultural patterns that made such individual heroes both assets and vulnerabilities for their communities. The final assault on the Hydebark settlements was timed to coincide with the tribal leadership's decision to surrender, their recognition that continued resistance would result in complete extermination, finally overcoming their desire to maintain independence. The moment of capitulation, however, triggered a psychological crisis in their greatest warrior that Caesar would later describe as the most spectacular display of individual combat prowess he had ever witnessed. The berserker rage that consumed the future Lanius when his tribe chose surrender over continued resistance resulted in a massacre that shocked even hardened Legion veterans accustomed to the brutal realities of imperial expansion. 15 Hydebark warriors, including several of his own relatives and closest companions, fell to his weapons before overwhelming numbers finally brought him down. His own tribesmen forced to participate in subduing the champion whose prowess had become a liability rather than an asset. Caesar's decision to preserve rather than execute this extraordinary warrior reflected both practical, strategic calculation and a deeper understanding of how individual, exceptional abilities could be integrated into imperial service. The healing process required months of careful medical attention, during which Caesar personally supervised the treatment while beginning the psychological transformation that would eventually produce his most effective military commander. The forging of the distinctive helmet that became Lanius's trademark represented more than practical necessity. It symbolized the complete transformation of tribal identity into imperial service. The warrior who had fought against Legion expansion with such devastating effectiveness was reborn as an instrument of that same expansion, his combat abilities now serving Caesar's strategic vision rather than tribal independence. The negotiation that secured Lanius's allegiance demonstrated Caesar's growing sophistication in managing the psychological dynamics of conquest and assimilation. The condition that Lanius be allowed to execute the surviving adult males of his former tribe served multiple purposes. It eliminated potential sources of future resistance, while completing the psychological break between the new Legion officer and his previous tribal loyalties. The Hydebark campaign's conclusion provided Caesar with more than just territorial expansion and an exceptional military commander. It offered crucial lessons in the management of large-scale military operations that would prove essential during the even more challenging campaigns that lay ahead. The logistical innovations developed during the extended siege, the tactical adaptations required for operations against sophisticated enemies, and the administrative procedures necessary for governing newly conquered territories all became standard elements of Legion doctrine. The integration of Hydebark survivors into Legion ranks followed patterns established during previous conquests, but required modifications to accommodate the military sophistication and cultural pride that distinguished them from earlier tribal acquisitions. The selection process for potential Legion officers became more rigorous, while the training programs for ordinary legionaries incorporated combat techniques and tactical knowledge that had proven effective during the Hydebark resistance. The expansion into New Mexico proceeded with greater speed and efficiency as Caesar applied the lessons learned during the Hydebark campaign to a series of smaller but still significant tribal conquests. The vast distances involved in these operations required innovations in communication, supply line management, and garrison deployment that transformed the Legion from a primarily offensive military force into an organization capable of simultaneously conquering new territories while maintaining control over previously acquired ones. The establishment of permanent Legion bases throughout New Mexico marked a crucial evolution in imperial administration. The development of standardized fortification designs, garrison rotations, and civilian governance procedures that could be replicated across diverse geographical and cultural contexts. These administrative innovations provided the foundation for the territorial control systems that would eventually span 4 southwestern states. The Twisted Hares represented one of the most significant tribal confederations that Caesar would encounter during the Eastern campaigns, their territories spanning much of what had once been western New Mexico and their political organization sophisticated enough to pose genuine strategic challenges to Legion expansion. Unlike the isolated tribes that had characterized Caesar's earlier conquests, the Twisted Hares maintained extensive trade relationships and military alliances that potentially gave them access to resources and manpower that could match Legion capabilities. The initial approach to the Twisted Hares reflected Caesar's growing preference for political over purely military solutions when dealing with enemies whose defeat might prove costly or uncertain. The treaty negotiations that established the Twisted Hares as Legion auxiliaries provided both parties with immediate advantages. Caesar gained access to their territorial knowledge and scouting capabilities, while the tribe avoided the destruction that had befallen less accommodating groups. The alliance with the Twisted Hares proved strategically valuable during the subsequent phases of Eastern expansion. Their intimate knowledge of desert survival and long-range reconnaissance providing intelligence capabilities that proved crucial during operations against tribes that might otherwise have remained hidden until they could organize effective resistance. The temporary nature of this arrangement, however, was never in doubt. Caesar viewed all such alliances as convenient expedients rather than permanent political solutions. The eventual betrayal and destruction of the Twisted Hares at Dry Wells demonstrated Caesar's understanding that imperial expansion required the elimination of all potential sources of independent political authority, regardless of their previous cooperation or usefulness. The meeting that resulted in their annihilation was carefully planned to ensure that no survivors could warn other potential allies about the true nature of Legion diplomacy. The psychological impact of the Dry Wells massacre extended far beyond the immediate elimination of the Twisted Hares as a political entity. It served notice to every tribal group in the Eastern Territories that cooperation with the Legion was temporary at best, that ultimate survival required complete submission to imperial authority rather than negotiated accommodation. The crucifixion of Twisted Hare leaders along major travel routes provided visible reminders of the fate that awaited those who trusted in Caesar's promises of alliance. The integration of Twisted Hare survivors into Legion ranks followed the now standard patterns of cultural destruction and identity transformation, but the process was complicated by their previous status as allies rather than conquered enemies. The psychological difficulties involved in transforming former treaty partners into loyal legionaries required innovations in indoctrination techniques that would prove valuable during future encounters with politically sophisticated enemies. The expansion into Colorado marked the beginning of Caesar's most ambitious territorial acquisitions. The vast distances and diverse tribal populations of the region requiring organizational capabilities that stretched Legion resources to their limits while providing opportunities for institutional development that would prove crucial during future conflicts with technologically advanced enemies. The Colorado campaigns would ultimately produce both Caesar's greatest military commander and the logistical systems that made large-scale imperial warfare possible. The tribal confederation known as the Hangdogs occupied territories around what had once been Denver, their unique cultural adaptation to post-war conditions, having produced a society that combined human intelligence with animal instincts through their partnership with the mutated canines that roamed the ruined city. The symbiotic relationship between the Hangdogs and their animal companions created military capabilities that Caesar's forces had never previously encountered. The Siege of Denver became the longest and most costly military operation in Legion history up to that point. The urban environment and unusual enemy capabilities requiring tactical innovations that challenged every assumption underlying Caesar's military doctrine. The coordination between human defenders and their animal allies created defensive advantages that conventional Legion assault tactics could not overcome through speed and aggression alone. The logistical nightmare that developed during the extended Denver campaign forced Caesar to choose between tactical withdrawal and strategic innovations that might preserve the legion's reputation for invincibility while developing new capabilities for urban warfare. The decision to continue the siege, despite mounting casualties, reflected not stubbornness, but recognition that failure at this stage could undermine the psychological foundations of imperial expansion. Laenius emerged as Caesar's primary military commander during the Denver operations, his exceptional combat abilities proving particularly valuable in the close quarters fighting that characterized urban operations. More importantly, his capacity for tactical adaptation and strategic thinking under extreme pressure demonstrated leadership capabilities that complemented his individual combat prowess, making him an ideal candidate for independent command responsibilities. The eventual conquest of Denver required innovations in siege warfare, urban assault techniques, and coordination between multiple legion centuries that would become standard doctrine for future operations against fortified positions. The destruction of the hangdog tribal identity followed established patterns, but the integration of their canine partners into legion service represented a unique addition to imperial military capabilities. The development of legion mongrel programs provided the empire with reconnaissance, guard, and assault capabilities that proved valuable during subsequent campaigns, while demonstrating the legion's capacity to adapt useful elements from conquered cultures without compromising fundamental military discipline. The training of hangdog survivors as houndmasters created specialized roles that utilized their cultural knowledge while serving imperial rather than tribal objectives. The establishment of Flagstaff as Caesar's permanent capital represented the culmination of institutional developments that had been evolving throughout the Eastern campaigns. The need for centralized administration of vast territories requiring facilities and procedures that went far beyond the field headquarters that had served during earlier phases of expansion. The construction projects involved in creating a true imperial capital required organizational capabilities that transformed the legion from primarily a military organization into a comprehensive governmental system. The architectural choices involved in Flagstaff's development reflected Caesar's vision of Roman grandeur, adapted to post-war realities. The integration of classical design principles with practical defensive requirements, creating a physical environment that reinforced ideological messages about imperial permanence and cultural superiority. The construction process itself provided training in engineering and administration that proved valuable during subsequent territorial development projects. The economic systems that emerged during this period of rapid territorial expansion required innovations that balanced the resource extraction necessary for continued military operations with the development investments that would make conquered territories productive contributors to imperial wealth rather than mere sources of tribute. The standardization of currency, taxation, and trade regulations created commercial networks that connected previously isolated regions while generating revenues that supported further expansion. The cultural transformation programs that had evolved during the tribal conquest phase required modification to accommodate the diverse populations and geographical scales involved in governing entire states rather than individual tribal territories. The development of standardized educational curricula, religious practices, and social institutions created shared imperial identity across vast distances while maintaining local administrative flexibility. The emergence of the Frumentarii as a specialized intelligence organization reflected Caesar's recognition that effective governance of vast territories required information-gathering capabilities that went beyond the tactical reconnaissance that had served during earlier military campaigns. The development of systematic espionage, counterintelligence, and communication networks provided the empire with strategic awareness that proved crucial during subsequent conflicts with external enemies. The recruitment and training programs that produced the first generation of Frumentari agents established precedents for the kind of long-term strategic thinking that would characterize Caesar's approach to external threats. The placement of agents in distant territories, providing early warning of potential enemies, while creating opportunities for preemptive action against threats before they could fully develop. As Caesar's 10th year of expansion drew to a close, the transformation of his domain from tribal confederation to territorial empire had created institutional capabilities that could support conflicts against enemies possessing industrial technology and unified command structures. The Eastern campaigns had provided not only territorial expansion, but the organizational development that would prove essential during the greater challenges that awaited when the Legion finally encountered the new California Republic. The foundations of empire were now complete. The military, administrative, and cultural innovations, developed through a decade of continuous conquest, having created a governmental system capable of indefinite expansion and permanent territorial control. The stage was set for the confrontations that would determine whether Caesar's vision of imperial order could prevail against the democratic ideals and industrial capabilities of the post-war world's other great power. The westward expansion that would ultimately bring Caesar's legion into direct confrontation with the new California Republic began not as a grand strategic design, but as the natural consequence of territorial consolidation that had reached the practical limits of eastward growth. By the end of his first decade of conquest, Caesar controlled territories that stretched from the Grand Canyon to the Colorado Plains, encompassing vast areas of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah that had been transformed from chaotic tribal battlegrounds into the ordered provinces of a genuine empire. The decision to push toward the Colorado River represented more than simple territorial ambition. It reflected Caesar's understanding that his empire had reached a critical juncture where continued expansion was necessary not merely for growth, but for survival. The tribal confederation model that had served so effectively during the early phases of conquest was inherently unstable when applied to the governance of settled populations across vast distances, requiring either evolution toward genuine imperial administration or inevitable fragmentation as regional commanders developed independent power bases. The intelligence reports that reached Caesar during this pivotal period painted a picture of Western territories that were undergoing their own process of political consolidation under the banner of the new California Republic. The emergence of a unified political entity controlling the industrial resources and population centers of pre-war California represented both opportunity and existential threat to Legion expansion. The opportunity, because successful conquest would provide resources that could fuel unlimited future growth. Threat, because failure to act decisively might allow the NCR to complete its own consolidation and expansion into territories that Caesar considered essential to his empire's survival. The philosophical implications of potential conflict with the NCR extended far beyond questions of territorial control or resource competition, encompassing fundamental disagreements about the nature of political authority, social organization, and human nature itself that made peaceful coexistence virtually impossible between the two emerging powers. Caesar's imperial system rested on principles of absolute authority, cultural uniformity, and the subordination of individual desires to collective military objectives that were fundamentally incompatible with the democratic ideals, cultural pluralism, and individual freedoms that formed the theoretical foundation of NCR governance. The contrast between Legion and Republic approaches to territorial expansion reflected these deeper philosophical differences in ways that made conflict inevitable, regardless of immediate strategic considerations. The Legion's method of conquest involved the complete destruction of existing political and cultural institutions, the elimination of local leadership, and the imposition of Roman identity through systematic indoctrination and cultural transformation. The NCR, by contrast, typically sought to incorporate new territories through negotiation, economic incentives, and the gradual extension of republican institutions, while preserving significant local autonomy and cultural diversity. The first encounters between Legion scouts and NCR patrols occurred along what would eventually become the Colorado River frontier, tentative probing operations that revealed to both sides the existence of a major rival whose capabilities and intentions remained largely mysterious. These initial contacts were characterized more by mutual reconnaissance than active hostility, each side attempting to gather intelligence about the other's military organization, technological capabilities, and territorial ambitions, while avoiding premature confrontation that might trigger major conflict before adequate preparations could be completed. The reports that reached Caesar from these early reconnaissance missions described an enemy whose military organization differed fundamentally from the tribal structures that had characterized all previous Legion opponents. The NCR maintained standing armies equipped with standardized weapons and armor, supported by industrial production capabilities that could sustain extended campaigns far from home territories. More significantly, their command structure reflected professional military traditions that emphasized tactical flexibility, technological innovation, and strategic coordination across multiple operational theaters. The implications of facing an industrialized enemy for the first time in Legion history required strategic adaptations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare that had proven successful during decades of tribal conquest. The individual combat superiority and unit discipline that had made Legion centuries virtually invincible against tribal warriors might prove inadequate against enemies equipped with advanced weapons, protected by superior armor, and supported by logistical systems that could maintain operational effectiveness indefinitely. Caesar's response to these challenges reflected the evolution of his strategic thinking from the relatively simple approaches that had characterized his early campaigns toward the sophisticated analysis of enemy capabilities, systematic preparation for unprecedented forms of conflict, the development of intelligence networks capable of gathering detailed information about NCR military organization, economic resources, and political vulnerabilities became as important as traditional military preparations for the confrontation that both sides increasingly recognized as inevitable. The establishment of permanent Legion bases along the Colorado River marked the beginning of a militarization process that would transform the frontier from a region of mutual reconnaissance into a heavily fortified boundary between incompatible political systems. The construction of these forward positions required engineering capabilities and logistical coordination that tested the organizational innovations developed during the Eastern campaigns, while providing practical experience in the kind of defensive warfare that might become necessary if initial offensive operations failed to achieve decisive results. The strategic significance of Hoover Dam became apparent to both sides during this period of frontier development. Its control of electrical power generation and water distribution throughout the region making it a prize whose capture could determine the outcome of any major conflict between Legion and Republic. The dam's pre-war construction had created a choke point that dominated the most practical crossing routes along hundreds of miles of the Colorado River, giving whoever controlled it decisive advantages in both offensive and defensive operations. Caesar's analysis of the strategic situation identified several key factors that would influence the timing and conduct of major operations against NCR positions. The Legion's advantages lay in unit discipline, individual combat effectiveness, and the psychological impact of their reputation for invincibility against tribal enemies. Their disadvantages included technological inferiority, limited industrial capacity, and inexperience with the kind of large-scale logistical operations that would be required for sustained warfare against an industrialized opponent. The NCR's strengths were essentially the inverse of Legion capabilities: superior technology, industrial production capacity, and experience with complex multi-unit operations. Their weaknesses appeared to include overextension of forces across vast territories, political constraints on military decision-making imposed by democratic governance, and potential vulnerability to the kind of psychological warfare tactics that had proven effective against less disciplined enemies. The development of Legion tactical doctrine during this preparatory phase reflected Caesar's understanding that success against the NCR would require innovations that preserved traditional advantages while addressing technological disparities that could not be overcome through discipline and courage alone. The integration of captured weapons and equipment into Legion arsenals began during this period, though always within limits designed to prevent dependence on technologies that could not be reliably maintained or replaced. The recruitment and training programs that produced the legionaries who would fight the First Battle of Hoover Dam incorporated lessons learned from observations of NCR military capabilities, while maintaining the cultural and psychological foundations that had made Legion forces effective against traditional enemies. The balance between adaptation and tradition would prove crucial during the unprecedented challenges of fighting an enemy whose military effectiveness rested on completely different foundations than tribal warfare. The intelligence operations that preceded major military action reached levels of sophistication that had never been required during previous Legion campaigns. The need for detailed information about enemy capabilities, dispositions, and intentions demanding the development of systematic espionage capabilities that could penetrate NCR security while protecting Legion operational plans from similar enemy efforts. The emergence of the Frumentari as a professional intelligence organization capable of long-term deep cover operations reflected these evolving requirements. The psychological preparation of Legion forces for conflict with the NCR required careful management of expectations and motivations that had been shaped by decades of victory against tribal enemies who possessed fundamentally different capabilities and fighting methods. The maintenance of morale and confidence while preparing for potentially costly battles against technologically superior opponents demanded leadership skills that had never been tested during previous campaigns where victory had been virtually guaranteed through superior organization and discipline. The selection and training of field commanders who could adapt Legion tactical principles to the demands of warfare against professional armies represented another crucial element of preparation for the coming conflict. The identification of officers capable of independent decision-making while maintaining loyalty to overall strategic objectives required evaluation criteria that went beyond the combat leadership skills that had proven adequate during tribal campaigns. Joshua Graham's evolution from linguistic specialist and cultural interpreter to military commander reflected the broader transformation of Legion leadership from tribal war chiefs to professional officers capable of commanding large-scale operations against sophisticated enemies. His appointment as Malpais legate represented Caesar's recognition that the coming conflict would require subordinate commanders capable of strategic thinking and tactical innovation while maintaining absolute loyalty to imperial objectives. The economic mobilization required to support major military operations against the NCR forced the Legion to develop resource extraction and allocation systems that went far beyond the tribute collection mechanisms that had served during tribal conquest phases. The standardization of taxation, labor conscription, and industrial production within Legion territories created the material foundation for sustained warfare, while demonstrating the Empire's evolution toward genuine governmental capabilities. The cultural and psychological preparation of civilian populations for major warfare represented an unprecedented challenge for Legion administration. The need to maintain production and social stability while supporting extended military campaigns requiring innovations in propaganda, social control, and resource management that tested every aspect of imperial governance. The success of these preparations would determine whether Caesar's empire could sustain the kind of prolonged conflict that seemed increasingly likely. The diplomatic initiatives that preceded major military action reflected Caesar's understanding that victory against the NCR would require more than purely military success, encompassing political warfare designed to exploit potential vulnerabilities in Republican governance, while preventing the formation of anti-Legion coalitions that might offset his military advantages. The subtle undermining of NCR authority in frontier territories through economic warfare, targeted violence, and propaganda operations became as important as traditional battlefield preparations. The timing of major offensive operations required careful calculation of numerous factors, including seasonal weather patterns, agricultural cycles that affected resource availability, political developments within NCR territories that might create opportunities or obstacles, and the completion of Legion military preparations that had been years in development. The decision to initiate major hostilities would represent a commitment to total war, whose outcome would determine the future of both political systems. The establishment of the Colorado River as the primary axis of conflict reflected geographical realities that made crossing points natural battlegrounds, while providing defensive advantages that could offset technological disparities between the opposing forces. The concentration of Legion resources along this frontier created the possibility for decisive battle under conditions that maximized their traditional advantages, while minimizing the impact of NCR technological superiority. The psychological atmosphere within Legion territories during this period of mounting tension reflected the confidence that had been built through decades of unbroken victory, combined with awareness that the coming conflict would test their capabilities against enemies unlike any they had previously faced. The maintenance of morale and determination, while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the challenges ahead, required leadership skills that demonstrated Caesar's evolution from tribal conqueror to imperial statesman. As the final preparations for major offensive operations neared completion, Caesar could survey his empire with justified pride in the institutional and military capabilities that had been developed through years of conquest and consolidation. The legion that would march against the new California Republic bore little resemblance to the desperate tribal confederation that had first emerged from the Grand Canyon, having evolved into a military and political organization capable of challenging the most advanced post-war civilization on the continent. The stage was set for confrontation between two incompatible visions of humanity's future in the post-war world, the outcome of which would determine whether democratic ideals or imperial discipline would shape the reconstruction of American civilization. The collision between Legion and Republic represented more than territorial dispute or resource competition. It was a fundamental test of competing theories about human nature, political organization, and the proper relationship between individual freedom and collective authority that would resonate throughout the wasteland for generations to come. The morning of October 2277 dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that often precedes moments of historical significance. the desert air carrying no hint of the violence that would soon transform the Colorado River from a natural boundary into a blood-soaked monument to the collision between incompatible civilizations. 4 years of preparation, intelligence gathering, and strategic positioning had brought both the Legion and the new California Republic to this inevitable confrontation, their armies poised on opposite sides of Hoover Dam in formations that represented not merely military deployment, but the physical manifestation of fundamentally opposed visions of humanity's future. The Legion forces that assembled for what would become known as the First Battle of Hoover Dam represented the culmination of Caesar's decade-long transformation of tribal chaos into imperial order, their ranks filled with veterans whose combat experience encompassed dozens of conquest campaigns, while their leadership structure reflected the meritocratic principles that had elevated the most capable warriors to positions of command, regardless of their tribal origins. At their head stood Joshua Graham, the Malpais legate, whose evolution from Mormon missionary to Caesar's primary military commander embodied the radical transformations that had characterized the Legion's rise to power. Graham's strategic plan for the assault reflected both the strengths and limitations of Legion military doctrine, as it had developed through years of warfare against tribal enemies whose capabilities bore little resemblance to the Plains' professional army that now awaited them across the Colorado River. The fundamental approach remained unchanged from successful tribal campaigns: overwhelming assault designed to achieve rapid victory through superior discipline, individual combat effectiveness, and the psychological impact of Legion invincibility that had never failed to break enemy morale during previous conflicts. The triplex Aces formation that Graham selected for the main assault represented classical Roman tactical thinking adapted to the specific geography of Hoover Dam, its three-line structure designed to maintain unit cohesion while providing continuous pressure against enemy positions that could not be outflanked due to the narrow confines of the dam's roadway. The arrangement placed veteran legionaries in the front rank, their combat experience and superior equipment intended to punch through initial NCR resistance, followed by prime legionaries who would exploit any breakthrough, with recruit cohorts held in reserve to either reinforce success or cover withdrawal if the assault failed. The psychological preparation of Legion forces for this unprecedented battle required careful management of expectations that had been shaped by decades of victory against enemies who typically broke and fled when confronted with disciplined Roman assault tactics. The NCR represented something entirely different, a professional military organization whose training, equipment, and tactical doctrine had been developed specifically to counter the kind of frontal assault tactics that had proven universally successful during tribal conquest campaigns. The intelligence reports available to Graham painted a picture of enemy defensive preparations that reflected both NCR strengths and potential vulnerabilities. Their positions along the dam, incorporating pre-war engineering advantages, while depending on the kind of technological superiority that Legion forces had learned to counter through superior discipline and tactical innovation. The placement of sharpshooters in elevated positions designed to disrupt Legion command structure showed sophisticated understanding of Roman tactical weaknesses, but also created potential targets for counter-battery fire if Legion forces could close the distance rapidly enough. The NCR defensive strategy, developed under the overall command of General Lee Oliver but heavily influenced by the tactical genius of Chief Hanlon, reflected professional military thinking that had been shaped by years of warfare against diverse enemies, ranging from tribal raiders to the technologically advanced Brotherhood of Steel. Unlike the tribal opponents that Caesar's forces had previously faced, the NCR possessed both the equipment and the strategic understanding necessary to turn Legion's strengths into weaknesses through careful preparation and disciplined execution. Hanlon's analysis of Legion capabilities had identified the key vulnerabilities in Roman tactical doctrine that professional military forces could exploit through proper positioning, superior firepower, and coordinated defensive operations that could absorb the initial shock of frontal assault while maintaining unit cohesion and command effectiveness. The placement of sharpshooters to target Legion officers reflected understanding that Roman military effectiveness depended heavily on maintaining command structure during the chaos of close combat. The preparation of Boulder City as a killing ground represented perhaps the most sophisticated element of NCR defensive planning, the transformation of an abandoned pre-war settlement into an elaborate trap that could channel Legion forces into predetermined positions where pre-placed explosives would maximize casualties while minimizing NCR losses. The psychological impact of such devastating tactical reversal was calculated to break Legion morale in ways that simple defensive resistance could never achieve. The morning of the battle found both armies completing final preparations that reflected their different approaches to military organization and combat effectiveness. Legion forces conducting the ritual prayers and weapon ceremonies that reinforced their cultural identity as warrior priests of Mars, while NCR units performed equipment checks and tactical briefings that emphasized coordination, communication, and adherence to predetermined operational plans. The Legion assault began at dawn with the kind of disciplined precision that had characterized their most successful tribal campaigns, veteran cohorts advancing across the dam's narrow roadway, in formation that maximized their combat effectiveness, while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The psychological impact of hundreds of legionaries advancing in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the morning sun and their battle cries echoing off the canyon walls, had never failed to break enemy resistance during previous campaigns. The initial contact between Legion assault troops and NCR defensive positions demonstrated immediately that this battle would differ fundamentally from anything in Caesar's military experience. The disciplined return fire from entrenched enemies, showing none of the panic or disorganization that had characterized tribal responses to Roman assault tactics. The NCR troops held their positions with professional determination, their superior weapons and defensive advantages beginning to take a toll on Legion forces that had never experienced such sustained, effective resistance. Graham's tactical adaptations during the early phases of the battle reflected both his military competence and the limitations imposed by Legion doctrine that emphasized frontal assault over the kind of tactical flexibility that might have been more appropriate against professional enemies. The commitment of additional cohorts to maintain assault momentum followed established patterns that had proven successful against tribal opponents, but played directly into NCR defensive preparations designed to absorb and channel Legion attacks. The effectiveness of NCR sharpshooter operations exceeded even Hanlon's optimistic projections, the systematic elimination of Legion officers creating command disruption that rippled through the attacking formations in ways that tribal enemies had never been able to achieve. The loss of experienced centurions and decanii during the critical early phases of the battle forced junior officers into command positions for which their training and experience had not adequately prepared them. The decision to commit Legion reserves to assault the elevated positions from which NCR sharpshooters were inflicting such devastating casualties represented Graham's recognition that the battle could not be won through conventional frontal assault alone, but his tactical solution remained constrained by doctrinal limitations that prevented more sophisticated approaches to the problem. The diversion of veteran troops from the main assault to deal with supporting enemy positions weakened the primary attack without eliminating the fundamental advantages that defensive preparation had provided to NCR forces. The movement of NCR troops away from the dam's central positions as Legion forces approached the sharpshooter nests appeared to confirm Graham's tactical assessment that aggressive action could force enemy withdrawal. The apparent success of his flanking maneuver, encouraging him to press the attack with the kind of bold aggression that had won dozens of previous battles. The sight of NCR forces pulling back from their prepared positions seemed to vindicate Legion tactical doctrine while offering the prospect of decisive victory through continued pressure. The Legion pursuit of withdrawing NCR forces into Boulder City represented the culmination of Graham's tactical plan, the opportunity to bring enemy troops to close combat where Legion advantages in individual combat effectiveness and unit discipline could overcome the technological disparities that had made the dam assault so costly. The entry of veteran cohorts into the abandoned settlement felt like the beginning of the decisive phase that would transform a difficult assault into another Legion victory. The detonation of Boulder City created a moment of absolute devastation that shattered not only the physical formations of attacking Legion forces, but the psychological foundations of Imperial military confidence that had been built through decades of unbroken victory. The massive explosion that vaporized hundreds of veteran legionaries in an instant represented more than tactical defeat. It demonstrated that Legion invincibility was an illusion that could be destroyed through superior preparation and professional military competence. The immediate aftermath of the Boulder City explosion saw the complete collapse of Legion assault operations as surviving units lost cohesion and command effectiveness, while NCR forces maintained disciplined defensive positions that prevented any possibility of recovering tactical initiative. The scale of casualties suffered by veteran cohorts eliminated not just immediate combat capability, but the experienced leadership that would have been essential for reorganizing surviving forces for renewed assault. Graham's attempts to salvage the battle through commitment of remaining reserves reflected the kind of desperate tactical thinking that characterized commanders whose strategic assumptions had been proven catastrophically wrong. But the demoralization that followed the Boulder City disaster had created psychological conditions that made effective military action impossible, regardless of the tactical competence of individual units or commanders. The retreat from Hoover Dam began as tactical withdrawal, designed to preserve surviving forces for future operations, but quickly devolved into the kind of disordered flight that Caesar's forces had previously witnessed only among their tribal enemies. The psychological shock of decisive defeat, undermining the discipline and unit cohesion that had been the foundation of Legion military effectiveness throughout their conquest campaigns. The casualty reports that reached Caesar in the days following the battle painted a picture of military disaster that exceeded the worst projections that had been considered during pre-battle planning. The loss of veteran officers and experienced legionaries representing not just immediate tactical defeat, but strategic damage that would require years to repair through recruitment and training programs that might never fully restore the Seven. Capabilities that had been destroyed in a single morning of combat. The political implications of the Legion's defeat extended far beyond immediate military considerations. The demonstration that Caesar's forces could be decisively beaten by professional armies, threatening to undermine the psychological foundations of imperial authority that had been built through decades of conquest and cultural transformation. The news of the defeat spread through Legion territories, with devastating impact on civilian morale and military recruitment, while encouraging potential enemies to consider resistance that had previously seemed hopeless. Caesar's response to the military disaster and its political consequences would define not only his personal legacy, but the future of the imperial system that had been built through his strategic vision and tactical innovations. The decision to make Joshua Graham personally responsible for the defeat reflected both the psychological necessity of maintaining imperial infallibility and the practical requirement for demonstrating that failure would be punished, regardless of previous service or personal relationships with the emperor himself. The ritual burning of the Malpais legate represented more than personal vengeance or scapegoating. It served as public demonstration that the legion's defeat resulted from individual failure rather than systemic weakness, preserving the theoretical possibility of future victory, while eliminating the commander whose tactical decisions had led to catastrophe. The theatrical nature of Graham's punishment was designed to maintain Legion morale while providing psychological closure that could enable recovery from devastating defeat. The selection of Lanius as Graham's replacement reflected Caesar's understanding that future military operations against the NCR would require leadership capable of learning from the tactical failures that had made the First Battle of Hoover Dam such a comprehensive disaster. The monster of the East possessed not only the combat effectiveness necessary for maintaining Legion military reputation, but the strategic intelligence required for developing tactical innovations that could counter NCR professional advantages. The 4-year period of recovery and preparation that followed the First Battle of Hoover Dam would test every aspect of Legion institutional capabilities. The need to rebuild military strength while maintaining territorial control and civilian loyalty, requiring administrative and organizational skills that had never been fully developed during the expansion phase of imperial development. The success of these recovery efforts would determine whether Caesar's empire represented a genuine alternative to NCR governance or merely a temporary aberration in the post-war political landscape. The strategic lessons learned from the battle's outcome would reshape Legion military doctrine in fundamental ways. The recognition that frontal assault tactics were inadequate against professional enemies, requiring innovations in training, equipment, and tactical thinking that preserved traditional strengths while addressing the vulnerabilities that had been so catastrophically exposed during the Dam assault. The development of these new approaches would consume years of effort, while competing powers consolidated their positions and prepared for the renewed conflict that both sides recognized as inevitable. The psychological impact of defeat on Legion civilian populations required careful management through propaganda campaigns that explained the setback in terms that preserved faith in imperial objectives while preparing popular opinion for the sacrifices that would be necessary during the recovery period. The maintenance of cultural unity and political loyalty, while acknowledging military failure, represented a challenge that tested Caesar's skills as a political leader rather than simply a military commander. The NCR's victory at Hoover Dam established them as the dominant military power in the post-war American Southwest, while providing strategic advantages that could be leveraged for further territorial expansion if they chose to pursue aggressive policies toward their defeated enemies. The decision to fortify their Colorado River positions rather than pursuing complete destruction of Legion capabilities reflected both political constraints imposed by democratic governance and strategic calculations about the costs and benefits of total war. The establishment of an armed frontier between Legion and Republic territories created a military situation that neither side had previously experienced. The presence of hostile professional armies, separated by clearly defined boundaries requiring new approaches to intelligence, logistics, and strategic planning that went far beyond the considerations that had shaped previous conflicts against tribal opponents or scattered raiders. As the immediate aftermath of the battle gave way to longer-term strategic considerations, both sides began the preparations that would eventually lead to the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. Their efforts, shaped by lessons learned from the first confrontation, while reflecting the fundamental incompatibility between imperial and republican systems that made lasting peace impossible, regardless of immediate military outcomes. The stage was set for renewed conflict that would test not only military capabilities but the political and economic systems that supported them, the ultimate victory belonging to whichever side could most effectively adapt their institutional advantages to the demands of modern warfare, while maintaining popular support for the sacrifices that total victory would require. The 4 years that followed Caesar's humiliating defeat at Hoover Dam marked a period of strategic transformation that would reshape not only Legion military doctrine but the fundamental nature of warfare in the post-nuclear American Southwest. The comprehensive nature of the defeat had shattered more than just tactical formations and unit cohesion. It had destroyed the myth of Legion invincibility that had served as the psychological foundation for decades of conquest and territorial expansion, forcing Caesar to confront the reality that his empire's survival depended on innovations that went far beyond traditional military reorganization. The immediate aftermath of the retreat from Hoover Dam revealed the true extent of the catastrophe that had befallen Legion forces. Casualty reports indicating losses that exceeded 30% of veteran legionaries, while eliminating nearly half of the experienced officer corps that had provided tactical leadership throughout the conquest campaigns. The destruction of this irreplaceable human capital represented strategic damage that could not be remedied through simple recruitment drives or accelerated training programs, requiring fundamental changes in Legion organization and doctrine that would take years to implement effectively. Caesar's analysis of the defeat identified several critical factors that had contributed to the disaster, chief among them the obsolescence of frontal assault tactics when applied against professional armies equipped with modern weapons and supported by sophisticated defensive preparations. The tactical innovations that had proven devastatingly effective against tribal opponents were revealed as predictable and easily countered when confronted by enemies who possessed both the technological capabilities and strategic understanding necessary to exploit Legion weaknesses. The appointment of Lanius as the new military commander represented more than simple replacement of a failed subordinate. It marked the beginning of a comprehensive restructuring of Legion, strategic thinking that would incorporate lessons learned from defeat while preserving the cultural and organizational elements that had made Caesar's forces effective during their expansion phase. The monster of the East brought to his new position not only exceptional combat capabilities, but strategic intelligence that had been honed through years of challenging campaigns in the Eastern Territories. The development of new tactical doctrines under Lanius's leadership reflected understanding that future success against the NCR would require approaches that maximized Legion advantages while minimizing the impact of enemy, technological superiority, and defensive preparation. The emphasis shifted from direct confrontation to asymmetric warfare designed to exploit NCR vulnerabilities while avoiding the kind of pitched battles where Republican forces held decisive advantages through superior equipment and coordinated tactical deployment. The implementation of terror campaigns west of the Colorado River represented a fundamental departure from previous Legion strategy, acknowledging that military conquest of NCR positions might be impossible through conventional means while recognizing that systematic psychological warfare could achieve strategic objectives through the gradual erosion of enemy morale and operational effectiveness. The shift from purely military to combined military-political approaches reflected Caesar's evolution from tribal conqueror to sophisticated imperial strategist. The destruction of Searchlight marked the beginning of this new phase of Legion operations, demonstrating both the innovative thinking that had emerged from defeat and the ruthless efficiency with which Caesar's forces could implement unconventional tactical solutions. The infiltration of NCR-controlled territory by small Legion teams capable of conducting complex sabotage operations showed tactical sophistication that had not been evident during the crude frontal assaults that had characterized the Process Antimote First Battle of Hoover Dam. The method chosen for Searchlight's destruction reflected careful analysis of NCR vulnerabilities and Legion capabilities. The unsealing of pre-war radioactive materials, requiring neither advanced technology nor large military formations, while producing devastating effects that exceeded anything conventional explosives could have achieved. The operation demonstrated that properly planned unconventional warfare could inflict strategic damage through minimal resource expenditure, while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation where Legion forces remained at disadvantage. The psychological impact of Searchlight's destruction extended far beyond the immediate military consequences of eliminating an NCR stronghold and garrison. The horrific nature of radiation poisoning, creating fear effects that influenced NCR operations throughout the Mojave region. The demonstration that Legion forces could strike deep into supposedly secure territory using weapons that defied conventional defensive preparations introduced uncertainty and demoralization that affected enemy decision-making at every operational level. The establishment of Cottonwood Cove as a major Legion staging area represented the practical exploitation of tactical success. The elimination of NCR presence at Searchlight, creating opportunities for permanent Legion positions west of the Colorado River that could support expanded operations against additional enemy targets. The transformation of an abandoned pre-war facility into a fortified base capable of supporting substantial Legion operations demonstrated organizational capabilities that had been enhanced rather than diminished by the lessons learned from defeat. The success of Aurelius of Phoenix in establishing and maintaining Legion presence at Cottonwood Cove, despite overwhelming NCR numerical superiority in the region, reflected both the tactical innovations that had emerged from strategic defeat and the exceptional leadership capabilities that Caesar's meritocratic system continued to produce. The Centurion's ability to inflict casualties at ratios exceeding 4-1 while maintaining operational security showed that Legion forces remained formidable when properly employed within their strategic limitations. The conquest of Nelson provided Caesar's forces with another strategic position along the Colorado River, while demonstrating the effectiveness of terror tactics in undermining NCR morale and operational efficiency. The capture and crucifixion of NCR personnel served multiple purposes: eliminating immediate resistance, providing visible demonstration of Legion ruthlessness, and creating psychological pressure on nearby enemy installations that significantly reduced their combat effectiveness. The transformation of Nelson from NCR outpost to Legion stronghold illustrated the systematic approach that had replaced the improvised tactics of earlier campaigns. The careful preparation of defensive positions and establishment of supply lines, showing institutional learning that enhanced Legion capabilities, even within the constraints imposed by limited resources and technological disadvantages. The success of relatively small Legion forces in maintaining control over captured positions, despite constant NCR pressure, demonstrated the effectiveness of new tactical approaches. The psychological warfare campaign directed against Camp Forlorn Hope represented perhaps the most sophisticated application of terror tactics that Legion forces had yet attempted. The systematic harassment and intimidation of NCR personnel, creating combat degradation that exceeded anything conventional military action could have achieved. The transformation of a major NCR installation into a demoralized, combat-ineffective liability illustrated the potential for asymmetric warfare to achieve strategic objectives that direct assault could never accomplish. The methods employed against Forlorn Hope reflected careful analysis of NCR, military psychology, and organizational vulnerabilities. The gradual escalation of pressure, designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing Legion resource expenditure. The use of sniper attacks, sabotage operations, and displays of captured personnel created cumulative stress effects that eventually rendered the installation incapable of meaningful contribution to NCR defensive operations, despite retaining theoretical military capabilities. The impact of Legion psychological warfare extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to influence NCR strategic planning throughout the Mojave region. The demonstrated vulnerability of supposedly secure installations, forcing enemy commanders to allocate resources to defensive measures that reduced their capacity for offensive operations. The psychological initiative gained through terror campaigns provided Legion forces with strategic advantages that compensated for technological and numerical disadvantages in conventional military capabilities. The Nipton operation represented the culmination of Legion psychological warfare innovation. Volpe's Inculta's conduct of the Lottery Massacre, demonstrating both the tactical creativity that had emerged from strategic defeat and the systematic application of terror as a force multiplier. The complete destruction of a civilian settlement served notice that NCR territorial control provided no protection against Legion operations, while creating fear effects that influenced behavior throughout enemy-controlled areas. The selection of Nipton as a target reflected strategic calculation rather than random violence. The town's position along major trade routes, ensuring that news of its destruction would spread rapidly through NCR territories, while its civilian population made military response more complicated for democratic government, constrained by public opinion considerations. The operation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of enemy political vulnerabilities that could be exploited through carefully planned atrocities. The theatrical nature of the Nipton massacre, with its elaborate lottery system and symbolic crucifixions, served both practical and psychological purposes that extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives. The ritualized violence created memorable images that would influence NCR personnel and civilian behavior long after the immediate military effects had been absorbed, while the systematic nature of the killing demonstrated Legion organizational capabilities that contradicted NCR propaganda about tribal barbarism and chaos. The establishment of Legion raiding camps throughout NCR territory represented systematic expansion of unconventional warfare capabilities that had proven effective during isolated operations against specific targets. The creation of permanent bases capable of supporting ongoing terror campaigns showed institutional commitment to asymmetric warfare that went beyond tactical expedients to become fundamental elements of Legion strategic doctrine. The positioning of raiding camps near key NCR installations and supply routes reflected sophisticated intelligence analysis that identified enemy vulnerabilities while providing multiple options for tactical exploitation. The ability to maintain these forward positions, despite constant NCR counterintelligence efforts, demonstrated both operational security capabilities and strategic patience that had not been evident during the improvised campaigns of earlier periods. The assault on Ranger Station Charlie marked a significant escalation in Legion capabilities, the complete elimination of an elite NCR unit, without sustaining casualties, representing tactical achievement that exceeded anything accomplished during the disaster at Hoover Dam. The operation demonstrated that properly planned and executed Legion attacks could overcome even the most capable enemy forces when tactical surprise and superior individual combat skills were effectively combined. The capture of a Ranger prisoner during the Station Charlie operation provided Caesar's forces with both intelligence assets and opportunities for additional psychological warfare that extended the tactical success beyond immediate military objectives. The torture and eventual crucifixion of the captured Ranger created visible symbols of Legion capabilities while providing enemy personnel with detailed knowledge of the fate that awaited them if captured during future operations. The systematic nature of Legion raids throughout NCR territory created cumulative effects that exceeded the sum of individual tactical successes. The constant pressure on enemy installations, forcing resource reallocation, and defensive postures that reduced NCR operational effectiveness throughout the region. The transition from isolated attacks to sustained campaign demonstrated institutional learning that transformed tactical expedience into strategic capabilities. The intelligence network that supported these expanded operations represented another area where Legion capabilities had been enhanced through learning from previous failures. The development of systematic reconnaissance and counterintelligence procedures providing operational security that had been lacking during earlier campaigns. The ability to gather detailed information about enemy positions and movements while protecting Legion operational plans showed organizational sophistication that complemented tactical innovations. The recruitment and training of specialized personnel for unconventional warfare operations required modifications to established Legion educational programs that preserved cultural identity while developing technical skills necessary for complex sabotage and infiltration missions. The creation of elite units capable of independent operation behind enemy lines showed adaptation to strategic requirements that went beyond traditional tribal warfare patterns. The coordination between different Legion units conducting simultaneous operations across vast geographical areas demonstrated command and control capabilities that had been enhanced rather than diminished by the organizational changes implemented following the Hoover Dam defeat. The ability to maintain operational tempo while preserving tactical security showed institutional learning that addressed previous weaknesses without sacrificing traditional strengths. The economic warfare component of Legion terror campaigns reflected understanding that NCR vulnerabilities extended beyond purely military considerations to encompass commercial and administrative systems that could be disrupted through targeted violence. The systematic attacks on trade caravans, supply convoys, and civilian infrastructure created economic pressure that complemented military operations while demonstrating the comprehensive nature of Legion's strategic thinking. The psychological impact of sustained terror campaigns began to influence NCR political decision-making. As reports of Legion capabilities reached civilian leadership in California, the demonstration of vulnerability, creating pressure for resource allocation and strategic responses that diverted attention from other political priorities. The extension of conflict beyond purely military dimensions showed Caesar's understanding that victory against democratic enemies required approaches that exploited political as well as tactical vulnerabilities. The development of Legion medical capabilities during this period reflected practical necessity created by unconventional warfare operations that often involved extended periods behind enemy lines where wounded personnel could not be evacuated for treatment. The innovations in field medicine and combat trauma care that emerged from operational requirements enhanced Legion capabilities while reducing dependence on conventional medical facilities that might be compromised by enemy action. The cultural adaptations that accompanied tactical innovation preserved Legion identity while accommodating operational requirements that differed significantly from traditional warfare patterns. The integration of unconventional methods with Roman military traditions, creating hybrid approaches that enhanced effectiveness without compromising institutional cohesion. The success of these adaptations demonstrated organizational flexibility that had not been evident during earlier periods when tactical doctrine remained rigid despite changing strategic circumstances. As the 4-year preparation period drew to a close, Caesar could survey the results of systematic innovation with justified satisfaction in the comprehensive transformation that had emerged from strategic defeat. The legion that prepared for the Second Battle of Hoover Dam bore little resemblance to the force that had been so catastrophically defeated during the first confrontation, having evolved into a military organization capable of both conventional and unconventional warfare while maintaining the cultural identity and organizational discipline that had characterized its earlier successes. The Terror campaign had achieved its strategic objectives of undermining NCR confidence and operational effectiveness, while providing Legion forces with valuable experience in the kind of asymmetric warfare that would be essential during future confrontations with technologically superior enemies. The psychological initiative, gained through sustained operations, had shifted strategic momentum in ways that created opportunities for decisive action when the time for renewed major military operations finally arrived. The internal organization of Caesar's Legion represented one of the most sophisticated military and political systems to emerge from the post-war wasteland. Its structure, combining elements of ancient Roman administration with innovations necessitated by the unique challenges of governing diverse populations across vast territories devastated by nuclear war. The systematic nature of Legion hierarchy reflected Caesar's understanding that lasting imperial control required more than military conquest. It demanded institutional frameworks capable of transforming conquered enemies into loyal citizens while maintaining operational effectiveness across multiple theaters of conflict. The foundation of Legion organization rested upon the principle of absolute meritocracy, advancement through ranks determined solely by demonstrated competence in warfare, leadership, and unwavering loyalty to Caesar's vision rather than tribal origins, family connections, or traditional status markers that had characterized pre-conquest social structures. This radical departure from wasteland norms created opportunities for exceptional individuals to rise from the lowest ranks to positions of supreme authority, while ensuring that leadership positions were filled by those most capable, fulfilling their responsibilities effectively. The recruit designation marked the entry point into Legion military service, encompassing both recently conquered tribal members who had completed initial indoctrination programs and children raised within Legion territories who had reached the age where military training could begin. The transformation from tribal identity to Legion loyalty required systematic destruction of previous cultural attachments, combined with intensive education in Roman customs, Latin language, and military discipline that created entirely new personal and social identities centered on service to the empire. The training regimen imposed upon recruits reflected both the practical requirements of creating effective soldiers and the ideological necessity of forging complete psychological transformation that would prevent regression to pre-conquest loyalties during moments of stress or uncertainty. The physical conditioning, weapons training, and tactical instruction were supplemented by cultural education that presented Legion expansion as sacred duty while demonizing enemies as threats to civilized order that must be eliminated without mercy or hesitation. The promotion from recruit to prime status represented recognition of combat effectiveness combined with demonstrated absorption of Legion values, the achievement marking not merely military competence, but successful cultural transformation that made individuals reliable representatives of Roman civilization. Prime legionaries formed the backbone of Legion military operations. Their combination of combat skills and ideological commitment, making them suitable for independent operations that required both tactical effectiveness and political reliability. The veteran rank acknowledged exceptional combat performance over extended periods, identifying legionaries whose experience and capabilities made them suitable for leadership responsibilities within the Centurion structure. The selection process for veteran status evaluated not only individual fighting ability, but capacity for maintaining unit cohesion under extreme stress, tactical innovation under changing battlefield conditions, and absolute loyalty to Legion objectives, regardless of personal cost or sacrifice. The Centurion rank represented the crucial transition from purely military roles to combined military administrative responsibilities, requiring individuals capable of commanding centuries in battle, while managing the complex logistical, disciplinary, and political challenges involved in governing conquered territories and maintaining Legion standards among diverse populations. The selection criteria for Centurions emphasized leadership capabilities that went beyond combat effectiveness to encompass strategic thinking, cultural sensitivity, and administrative competence. The responsibilities assigned to Centurions reflected the comprehensive nature of Legion governance, their duties encompassing military command, civilian administration, economic oversight, and cultural indoctrination programs that maintained imperial unity across vast geographical areas populated by groups whose origins and traditions had been systematically eliminated, but whose potential for renewed resistance required constant vigilance and sophisticated management techniques. The legatus rank marked the apex of Legion military hierarchy below Caesar himself, reserved for individuals who had demonstrated not only exceptional combat leadership, but strategic intelligence, capable of independent command over multiple centuries during complex operations that might last for years and encompass territories the size of pre-war states. The appointment of legates required Caesar's personal approval and reflected complete confidence in their loyalty, competence, and commitment to imperial objectives. The specialized roles within Legion structure reflected both practical military requirements and the systematic approach to governance that had evolved during decades of territorial expansion and administrative consolidation. The Vexillarius served as standard bearer and morale symbol, their presence on battlefields providing visible representation of Legion, unity and invincibility, while their survival or death during combat operations carried psychological significance that extended far beyond individual casualties. The Explorer designation encompassed reconnaissance specialists whose responsibilities included territorial mapping, enemy surveillance, and communication between distant Legion installations, their duties requiring combination of wilderness, survival skills, tactical intelligence, and cultural knowledge that enabled effective operation in hostile territory for extended periods without support from conventional military units. The development of specialized combat roles reflected Legion adaptation to diverse tactical requirements encountered during expansion into territories that presented unique challenges requiring capabilities beyond those provided by standard infantry training. The incorporation of war dogs and their handlers from conquered hangdog territories demonstrated institutional flexibility that could preserve useful capabilities while integrating them into Roman military structure without compromising fundamental organizational principles. The support structure that sustained Legion military operations encompassed blacksmiths responsible for weapon maintenance and production, instructors who managed training programs for new recruits, medical personnel who provided battlefield trauma care, and quartermaster specialists who handled supply distribution and inventory management. These roles were typically filled by veteran legionaries whose combat experience qualified them for positions of responsibility, while their proven loyalty ensured reliable performance of duties essential to military effectiveness. The slave system that provided labor for non-military activities represented a crucial component of Legion economic organization, the systematic exploitation of captured enemies and their descendants providing the foundation for infrastructure development, agricultural production, and manufacturing capabilities that supported continued military expansion. The management of slave populations required administrative sophistication that balanced maximum productivity with security concerns related to potential rebellion or sabotage. The integration of female populations into Legion society reflected both practical necessity and ideological commitment to gender role specialization that maximized reproductive potential while providing essential services that could not be performed by military personnel. The assignment of women to religious, medical, educational, and domestic roles created parallel hierarchies that supported military operations while maintaining cultural traditions that reinforced Legion identity and social cohesion. The educational systems that produced literate, culturally unified Legion citizens represented perhaps the most sophisticated achievement of Caesar's administrative innovations. The systematic instruction in Latin language, Roman history, military tactics, and imperial ideology, creating shared intellectual frameworks that transcended tribal origins, while providing practical skills necessary for effective participation in complex organizational structures. The religious hierarchy centered on Mars worship served both spiritual and political functions, providing ideological justification for continuous warfare while creating ceremonial structures that reinforced Legion unity and discipline. The integration of combat effectiveness with religious devotion transformed military service from practical necessity into sacred calling, creating motivational frameworks that sustained morale during extended campaigns and difficult operational conditions. The communication networks that connected Legion territories across thousands of miles required systematic development of courier services, signal systems, and administrative procedures that could maintain operational coordination despite geographical obstacles and enemy interference. The reliability of these communication capabilities determined the effectiveness of strategic planning and tactical coordination that made large-scale military operations possible. The economic systems that supported Legion expansion combined traditional tribute collection with more sophisticated resource extraction and distribution networks that balanced immediate military requirements with long-term development objectives. The standardization of currency, taxation procedures, and commercial regulations created unified economic structures that facilitated trade while generating revenues necessary for continued territorial expansion. The judicial system that maintained order within Legion territories reflected both Roman legal traditions and practical requirements for governing diverse populations whose cultural backgrounds and social expectations differed significantly from imperial norms. The emphasis on swift, decisive punishment for violations of Legion law created deterrent effects that minimized internal conflict while demonstrating the consequences of challenging imperial authority. The recruitment mechanisms that provided continuous influx of new legionaries adapted to changing demographic conditions and territorial expansion requirements. The systematic identification and training of potential officers, ensuring leadership continuity, while recruitment quotas maintained military strength at levels necessary for both garrison duties and offensive operations. The balance between voluntary enlistment and forced conscription reflected both ideological preferences and practical necessities related to manpower availability. The logistical networks that supplied Legion forces during extended campaigns represented massive organizational achievements that coordinated resource production, transportation, and distribution across vast distances, while maintaining operational security against enemy interference. The development of standardized equipment, uniform specifications, and maintenance procedures created economies of scale that reduced costs while ensuring reliability under combat conditions. The intelligence services that provided strategic information about enemy capabilities and intentions evolved from simple reconnaissance operations into sophisticated espionage networks capable of long-term penetration of hostile organizations. The Frumentarii system represented the culmination of these developments, creating professional intelligence capabilities that matched or exceeded those of any post-war organization, while maintaining absolute loyalty to Legion objectives. The medical capabilities that sustained Legion combat effectiveness during extended operations combined traditional tribal healing knowledge with systematic training in trauma treatment and battlefield medicine. The development of healing compounds from local plant materials provided medical advantages that reduced casualty rates, while demonstrating the practical benefits of cultural integration that preserved useful knowledge while eliminating potentially subversive traditional practices. The engineering capabilities that supported Legion infrastructure development reflected both practical military requirements and ideological commitment to creating permanent monuments to imperial achievement. The construction of roads, fortifications, and administrative facilities demonstrated organizational competence while providing psychological reinforcement for both Legion personnel and civilian populations regarding the permanence and sophistication of Roman civilization. The cultural preservation efforts that maintained Legion identity across diverse geographical and demographic contexts required systematic development of shared traditions, ceremonial practices, and historical narratives that created emotional attachments to imperial objectives. The standardization of festivals, military honors, and religious observances provided common experiences that transcended tribal origins while reinforcing values essential to Legion unity. The industrial capabilities that emerged within Legion territories reflected both captured technologies and innovations developed to meet specific military requirements. The systematic exploitation of pre-war facilities and equipment, providing manufacturing capacity that reduced dependence on external suppliers while creating economic foundations for sustained military operations. The population management policies that governed civilian life within Legion territories balanced economic productivity requirements with security considerations related to potential rebellion or resistance. The systematic relocation of populations and integration of different ethnic groups, creating demographic patterns that minimized tribal cohesion while maximizing imperial control. As Caesar surveyed the institutional achievements that had emerged from decades of conquest and administrative innovation, he could take satisfaction in the creation of governmental systems that had transformed chaotic tribal territories into the ordered provinces of a genuine empire. The organizational structures that had evolved through practical experience and systematic refinement provided foundations for unlimited territorial expansion, while maintaining the cultural identity and military effectiveness that had made Légion Dominance possible. The machine of empire functioned with precision that exceeded anything the post-war world had previously witnessed. Its component parts coordinated through hierarchical relationships that balanced individual initiative with collective discipline, while providing opportunities for advancement that motivated exceptional performance throughout all levels of Tang Legion society. The systematic nature of these achievements represented not merely military success, but civilizational triumph that validated Caesar's vision of Roman restoration in the post-nuclear wasteland. The dawn of October 23rd, 2281, brought with it the culmination of 4 years of preparation, strategic innovation, and institutional transformation that had reshaped Caesar's legion from a force devastated by catastrophic defeat into the most formidable military organization the post-war American Southwest had ever witnessed. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam would test not merely the tactical improvements that had emerged from systematic analysis of previous failures, but the fundamental question of whether imperial discipline could triumph over republican ideals in the contest that would determine the future of post-nuclear civilization. The multiple pathways to victory or defeat that would unfold during this pivotal confrontation reflected the complex interplay of strategic preparation, tactical innovation, and individual decision-making that characterized warfare between sophisticated opponents whose capabilities had been honed through decades of conflict against diverse enemies. The outcome would depend not only on military factors but on political considerations, technological advantages, and psychological elements that extended far beyond simple questions of battlefield effectiveness or numerical superiority. The scenario in which Legion forces achieved decisive victory demonstrated the effectiveness of the systematic innovations that had transformed Caesar's military capabilities during the 4 years of preparation that followed the first battle's catastrophic outcome. The successful exploitation of the intake towers that NCR intelligence had failed to secure created tactical opportunities that neutralized the defensive advantages that had made Republican positions virtually impregnable during conventional assault operations, while coordinated attacks throughout the Mojave region prevented enemy reinforcements from reaching the critical battlefield. The infiltration of NCR positions through underground passages that had been identified through systematic intelligence operations enabled Legion forces to attack defended positions from multiple directions simultaneously, creating tactical situations where Republican advantages in technology and prepared positions were offset by the confusion and command disruption that resulted from unexpected assault vectors. The success of these operations validated the strategic emphasis on intelligence gathering and tactical innovation that had characterized Legion preparations. The coordination of diversionary attacks throughout the Mojave region demonstrated the comprehensive nature of Legion strategic planning. The simultaneous assaults on Camp Forlorn Hope, Camp Gulf, and other NCR installations, preventing the concentration of enemy forces that might have enabled successful defense of Hoover Dam, despite the tactical innovations that had been developed during the preparation period. The systematic application of force multiplication through auxiliary alliances created combat advantages that exceeded simple numerical calculations. The Great Khan's assault on NCR rear positions eliminated the possibility of tactical withdrawal that had enabled Republican forces to preserve their strength during the first battle, while attacks by the Omertas within New Vegas itself created political complications that prevented civilian authorities from supporting military operations with the kind of unified commitment that democratic governance theoretically provided. The exploitation of internal NCR contradictions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of enemy political vulnerabilities. The effectiveness of Legion artillery during the successful assault scenario reflected years of technical training and equipment development that had created capabilities entirely absent during previous campaigns. The systematic destruction of NCR defensive positions and communication systems, creating tactical conditions that enabled conventional assault tactics to succeed where they had previously failed catastrophically. The integration of advanced weapons with traditional Legion strengths produced synergistic effects that exceeded the sum of individual improvements. The psychological impact of Legion victory extended far beyond immediate military consequences to encompass political transformations that would reshape the entire American Southwest. The demonstration of Republican vulnerability, encouraging collaboration among groups that had previously supported NCR expansion, while creating opportunities for territorial acquisition that could fuel continued imperial growth. The success validated Caesar's strategic vision while providing foundations for unlimited future expansion. The alternative scenario, in which NCR forces successfully defended Hoover Dam, illustrated the continuing challenges that Legion expansion faced when confronting enemies whose technological advantages and defensive preparations could offset imperial tactical innovations. The failure of diversionary operations to prevent effective coordination of Republican defensive efforts demonstrated the limits of even sophisticated strategic planning when facing opponents whose institutional capabilities matched or exceeded Legion organizational effectiveness. The successful defense of intake tower positions by NCR engineers who had identified and secured these potential vulnerability points showed that Republican intelligence capabilities could match Legion innovations when properly applied, while the effectiveness of coordinated defensive fire from prepared positions demonstrated that technological advantages could overcome individual combat superiority when tactical conditions favored the more advanced opponent. The political resilience that enabled NCR forces to maintain unit cohesion despite internal attacks and psychological warfare operations reflected institutional strengths that differentiated Republican governance from the tribal systems that had characterized previous Legion opponents. The capacity to absorb tactical setbacks while maintaining strategic effectiveness, creating defensive advantages that went beyond purely military considerations to encompass political and social factors. The scenario involving Legion tactical victory, followed by strategic complications, demonstrated the complex relationship between military success and political consolidation that characterized warfare between advanced opponents, the capture of Hoover Dam providing immediate advantages that might prove temporary if broader strategic conditions prevented effective exploitation of battlefield achievements. The challenges of governing captured territories while maintaining military pressure against remaining enemy forces tested imperial capabilities in unprecedented ways. The resistance encountered from NCR civilian populations in newly conquered territories reflected political loyalties that differed fundamentally from the tribal affiliations that had characterized previous Legion expansion. The ideological commitment to Republican principles, creating psychological obstacles to cultural transformation that could not be overcome through traditional methods of identity, destruction, and Roman indoctrination. The adaptation of Legion governance techniques to democratic populations required innovations that had not been necessary during tribal conquest campaigns. The economic challenges associated with integrating NCR industrial capabilities into Legion resource systems demonstrated the complexity of absorbing advanced civilizations whose technological and administrative requirements exceeded anything the Empire had previously encountered. The preservation of manufacturing capacity while imposing imperial control required administrative sophistication that tested institutional capabilities that had been developed for governing primarily agricultural and pastoral populations. The long-term strategic implications of various battle outcomes extended beyond immediate territorial considerations, to encompass questions about the sustainability of competing governmental systems under post-war conditions, the effectiveness of imperial expansion versus republican consolidation, creating precedents that would influence political development throughout North America for generations to come. The philosophical dimensions of the conflict transcended practical military considerations to address fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. The scenario in which neither side achieved decisive victory reflected the possibility that evenly matched opponents might reach strategic stalemate that required resolution through means other than conventional military action. The continuation of territorial division along the Colorado River, creating conditions for extended conflict that could drain resources from both sides, while preventing either from achieving the continental dominance that their respective dominance ideologies seem to require. The development of permanent frontier conditions between Legion and Republic territories would necessitate institutional adaptations that neither side had previously required. The maintenance of standing armies and fortified positions, creating economic burdens that could influence internal political development, while limiting resources available for expansion into territories controlled by other factions, or hostile environmental conditions that made settlement challenging. The influence of external factors on the ultimate resolution of Legion-Republic rivalry included considerations ranging from environmental changes that might affect resource availability to the emergence of other major powers whose expansion could threaten both existing factions regardless of their mutual antagonism. The Brotherhood of Steel, Enclave remnants, and various tribal confederations represented potential complications that could influence strategic calculations in ways that transcended bilateral military competition. The role of individual decision-makers in determining historical outcomes became particularly significant in conflicts between advanced opponents whose institutional capabilities were sufficiently developed to support multiple strategic options. The choices made by key figures, potentially determining whether military advantages could be translated into lasting political achievements, or would prove temporary expedients that failed to address fundamental strategic challenges. The technological dimensions of Legion-Republic competition reflected broader questions about the relationship between advanced industrial capabilities and effective governance in post-war conditions. The NCR's superior manufacturing capacity potentially being offset by Legion's more efficient resource allocation and political unity, while Republican technological advantages might prove less decisive than Imperial advantages in social control and military organization. The cultural implications of various conflict outcomes encompassed questions about the preservation of pre-war knowledge and institutions versus the development of entirely new approaches to civilization that might prove more suitable to post-nuclear, environmental, and social conditions. The Legion's systematic destruction of existing cultural patterns could represent either catastrophic loss of accumulated human wisdom or necessary adaptation to changed circumstances that made traditional approaches obsolete. The demographic consequences of prolonged warfare between major powers threatened to undermine the population base that supported both competing systems. The casualty rates associated with modern military technology, creating human resource constraints that could force strategic adaptations, regardless of political preferences or ideological commitments. The sustainability of imperial expansion and republican governance both depended on maintaining population levels sufficient to support complex institutional structures. The economic competition between Legion tribute systems and NCR market mechanisms represented alternative approaches to resource allocation that reflected fundamental philosophical differences about the proper relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare, the effectiveness of each system under post-war conditions, potentially determining which approach would be adopted by other emerging civilizations throughout the former United States. The administrative challenges associated with governing diverse populations across vast territories tested both imperial and republican capabilities in ways that revealed institutional strengths and weaknesses that might not be apparent. During periods of expansion or consolidation, the complexity of managing multi-ethnic, multicultural societies, creating governance problems that required sophisticated solutions regardless of underlying political philosophy. The military innovations that emerged from Legion-Republic competition created tactical and strategic precedents that influenced warfare throughout the post-war world. The development of new approaches to siege warfare, urban combat, and coordination between conventional and irregular forces, providing lessons that could be applied by other factions facing similar challenges in their own territorial expansion or defensive operations. The intelligence warfare that characterized the prolonged competition between Legion and Republic demonstrated the crucial importance of information gathering and analysis in conflicts between advanced opponents, the systematic penetration of enemy organizations, and the protection of friendly operations, requiring institutional capabilities that exceeded anything previously necessary during conflicts with less sophisticated enemies. As the various potential outcomes of the Second Battle of Hoover Dam played out across the landscape of possibility, each scenario revealed different aspects of the fundamental tension between imperial and republican approaches to post-war reconstruction, the ultimate resolution determining not only immediate territorial control, but the direction of human civilization's recovery from nuclear catastrophe. The legacy of the Bull endured regardless of specific military outcomes. Caesar's transformation of tribal chaos into imperial order, representing an achievement that transcended individual battles or territorial acquisitions to demonstrate the possibility of creating sophisticated governmental institutions under post-war conditions that had seemed to preclude Such developments. The systematic nature of Legion expansion and the institutional innovations that had emerged from decades of conquest and consolidation provided foundations for continued imperial development, even if immediate military objectives were not achieved. The organizational capabilities and cultural unity that characterized Caesar's empire, creating resilience that could survive tactical setbacks while maintaining strategic momentum toward ultimate continental dominance. The eternal nature of Legion commitment to expansion and cultural transformation ensured that temporary military defeats would not prevent continued pressure against Republican positions, the institutional mechanisms that sustained imperial growth, operating independently of individual battles or leadership changes, to create inexorable momentum toward the realization of Caesar's vision for post-war America. And so we reach the end of our journey through the blood-soaked annals of Caesar's Legion, from the desperate gamble of a captured anthropologist to the rise of an empire that spans the width of the American Southwest. In the quiet darkness of your rest, let the echoes of marching feet and the distant sound of Latin commands fade into the peaceful silence of sleep. The Legion's story continues beyond our telling, written in the red dust of Arizona mesas and the disciplined ranks of soldiers who have never known defeat. Whether viewed as saviors or conquerors, liberators or oppressors, their impact on the post-war world cannot be denied. From tribal chaos, they forged order. From scattered peoples, they created a nation. Sleep now, traveler, and dream not of war, but of peace. Let the harsh sun of the Mojave give way to gentle starlight, and may your slumber be undisturbed by the conflicts that rage in distant wastelands. The bull's banner may fly over vast territories, but here in the sanctuary of rest, all empires fade to whispers, and all conquests become merely stories told in the quiet hours before dawn, true to Caesar, true to the legion, true to the eternal cycle of rise and fall that governs all human endeavors in this transformed world.